So, in the last lecture, I hope we saw what moral luck is and why it challenges the control principle. And I'll say a bit more about that. But before I do, I want to dig more deeply into the different kinds of moral luck. Um, so far, we've only really looked at one sort of moral luck, and that's moral luck in how one's actions turn out, right? You know, you do the same thing, or two people do the same thing but different results. We blame the one person because the results are different. That is one sort of moral luck, how actions turn out not in their control. But Nagel gives us a good breakdown of four different sorts of moral luck. Um, there's luck in how actions turn out, luck in the sort of person one is, luck in the choices one faces, and luck in how one is determined by circumstances. Now, you know, I think sometimes Nagel puts the matter in a way that kind of begs the question against the libertarian, right? The libertarian about free will. But I want to look at each of these and see how the libertarian would respond. And even though Nagel sometimes I think sets it up in a way that a libertarian might grumble is question begging, I think that for all of these, they're still going to be deeply disturbing to a libertarian about free will. And it's not clear to me that the libertarian response is a great one, that it's all that compelling itself. So, each of these is going to turn out to be deeply problematic. Not clear to me the libertarian's going to have a good response. So, luck and how actions turn out. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because we've already, talked about a lot of cases of this one. This is probably the most obvious, the easiest sort of moral luck to see. And, I don't know that there's an obvious response for the libertarian on this one. I'm not sure. We'll talk about some possible responses, later on. They're kind of hard to accept, though. Another sort of moral luck, though, is luck in the sort of person you are. Nagel focuses on character here, right? And Nagel rightly points out we don't just blame people for what they do, we don't just praise people for what they do, we blame and praise them for the kind of person they are. One obvious way we do this is we blame people, or at the very least we think less of them, for having certain vices. If they are an envious person, if they are a spiteful person, if they are a cowardly person, if they are greedy, right? If they are petty. And we still look down on these, even if they might choose to overcome their vices, right? The spiteful, petty, envious person who knows he should shake the hand of someone who just beat him in a game and goes over but hates every second of it. We think differently about that guy than we do the guy who just inwardly thinks, yeah, that was a good game. Yeah. Well, well played. I respect him. Dang, he won. I'm going to shake his hand, right? We also praise people for their virtues, right? We blame them, we condemn them for their vices. But good traits of character like generosity, bravery, temperance, self control, kindness. We think more of a person if they have those character traits, right? But there are other sorts of things here too that kind of go in the type of person you are category. Think about the effect of culture and the historical moment one finds oneself in, right? If you are an open racist in 2021, you are a remarkably bad person, right? If you're openly racist, that's just, there's no excuse for that in 2021, right? But roll the clock back 100 years. If you were born in many places 100 years ago, you would have had to be a remarkably good person not to be openly racist, right? It was pretty common. It was culturally accepted. We might have grandparents or other people in our families who have some nasty attitudes because of the time and place they were born. My own grandmother did, right? I'll say that. We don't have those attitudes, or hopefully we don't, but a lot of that's just because the time and place we were born. That's not in our control. And the libertarian will say, look, Nagel. You talk about character here. Sure, fine, you're right. We don't just blame people for what they do or praise people for what they do. We praise and blame them for character. But you know what? People shape their own character, Nagel. Aristotle, the first philosopher to really put a lot of emphasis on people's character, talks about this, right? Talks about habituation. You know, people aren't just born brave, they become brave by practicing it. They become generous by practicing it, right? Um, Aristotle has this great quote: "You become brave by doing brave things, generous by doing generous things." And that sounds crazy, but it's right, right? Over time, you get in the habit of being brave by doing brave things, generous by giving money away even when you don't feel like it. It gets easier, right? So this does seem to me true. People definitely do play a role in shaping their own character. So this is not a slam dunk for Nagel, the fact we blame and praise people for traits of character, not just actions, because people, of course, do play a role, it seems, in shaping their character. But I think the response here is that obviously no one has complete control over their character. Genetics play a role, right? Different people are going to have different temperaments just based on their inheritance, right? Just their genes they inherit. Just by nature, different people have different temperaments. And here's the thing, right? It will be harder for some people, we might think being a hothead, losing your temper too easily is a vice. But for some people, it's going to be harder to have good temper, to control their temper than others because of the character they inherit from their parents. And environment plays a role, right? How you are raised plays a role. If your parents raise you to be a good sport, if your parents raise you to share, if your parents raise you to face your fears, you're going to have a lot easier time developing these virtues than the child of someone who him or herself has spiteful, petty, cowardly parents who never encourage any of this stuff, right? If your parents raise you to have good character, it's going to be a lot easier for you to acquire good character than if your parents are just horrible, terrible people who tell you that being decent to others is for suckers, right? Some people will have to struggle much harder to develop good character than others. If your upbringing is bad enough, it might honestly be impossible for you to acquire good character. I don't know if that's true or not, but even Aristotle, who put so much emphasis on habituation, said if your upbringing is bad enough, it's just impossible for you to ever develop truly good character. Now, maybe he was too pessimistic, but at the very least, it does seem much harder for some people, given their genetic inheritance and given their upbringing, to develop these virtues than others. Much easier for them to fall into these bad character traits, to have these vices. And, think about traits like racism or sexism or other forms of bigotry or other bad attitudes you might get from your culture, right? It's going to be way harder for some people to avoid those, just given when and where they were born, than others. You know, I have no choice that I was born and raised in the modern era. Had I been born in 1879 instead of 1979, it would probably be a lot harder for me to avoid having some really nasty attitudes on these things. But when I was born is a complete matter of luck, right? Another sort of moral luck. Luck in the choices you face. We blame the Germans who became Nazis, right? Germans who became Nazis, we think they're definitely horrible. We blame even the Germans who just kind of like closed their eyes and plugged their ears and pretended nothing was going on, who didn't become Nazis but let the Nazis do this stuff, right? The same goes for the French and others in occupied Europe who collaborated with the Nazis. Um, you know, we kind of have this myth that the French were especially bad. They weren't. Some countries were better than others, but in pretty much every country occupied by the Nazis, most people did nothing. A smaller but still very large group actively collaborated, and only a very, very tiny group actively resisted, right? Um, the English tend to be kind of smug about this, the Brits. Um, but there were actually a few little parts of Britain, the sort of Channel Islands, that were occupied by the Nazis. The Brits there behaved just as badly as the French or anybody else. Way more collaborators than resistors, and people who didn't collaborate but didn't really do anything to resist, the most common of all. And look, you and I probably pat ourselves on the back for not being like these people. We hopefully, I really hope this holds true when listening to this, we have not chosen to become Nazis, right? We haven't even let horrible, horrible things happen to our neighbors or people we know from groups like the Nazis, right? We haven't stood idly by as people were carted off to concentration camps, right? But here's the thing. We never faced the same choice they did, right? If you were a German living in the 30s, there were real costs a lot of times for not joining the Nazi Party. It was a socially accepted thing to do. There were rewards, there were benefits for joining. If you were one of those people who wasn't quite bad enough to join the Nazis or careerist enough or whatever, but you just kind of turned a blind eye to it, there were huge costs for trying to resist what the Nazis were doing. We never faced the choices they did. The choice, join this socially accepted party with real benefits. Yes, there are weirdos, losers who become Nazis these days, but it's not the same choice, right? It's not socially accepted. It doesn't have the benefits in the way that it did for them, right? We've certainly never faced the choice we will resist this horrible injustice at the cost of terrible things happening to us, right? We can either turn a blind eye to our neighbor getting carted off to a camp and killed, or we can resist and maybe suffer the same fate. None of us have faced that choice. And Nagel says, rightly, many of us would behave terribly. We would collaborate, or we would even join the Nazis if we were in the situation of the people who did. Even more of us, even those, people, if we wouldn't join the party or collaborate, even more of us would just turn a blind eye and let this happen. And I think the libertarian would say to Nagel, okay, look, Nagel, now here you're begging the question, right? You assume that there's some fact about how each of us would behave if we were in the situation of Germans in the 30s or the French from, I forget when the French turned, it was 1940 to 45, right, I think. Anyway, you assume that there's a fact about how each of us would behave. We'd join the party or collaborate or turn a blind eye, or we wouldn't. But choice is not determined. If you're a libertarian, you think how we would act is not determined. It's not up to us. It is up to us. There's no fact until you actually face the situation. Because choices are free, there's no fact that's clear about how we would behave. We have to make the actual choice. I think the response is this, right? Okay, let's grant that. Let's say that that's true. Let's give the libertarian that. Just statistically, we know that there's a pretty good chance most of us wouldn't behave well. Most people didn't. The vast majority didn't. Maybe we would, right? The odds are most of us wouldn't, right? If you just look at the odds, most of us probably would choose to do the wrong thing. Whether that's joining the party and collaborating for these advantages, or just the lesser evil of turning a blind eye to what they're doing. Both of those are wrong. The right thing to do is resist, but we know, just from how people behaved, that's unlikely. But we never face this choice just by luck, right? We never have the choice to become Nazis that Germans in the 30s had. We never have the choice to collaborate with an invading power and betray our countries and neighbors that French people in the 40s had, right? There's a very good chance that most of us would behave in ways that are not great, but we're spared from that by never facing the choice. Now, I actually think of all the sorts of moral luck, this one might be the most disturbing, right? Because even if we grant the libertarian about free will, that our choices are always free, well, the problem is the choices that we have, the specific choices that we get to make, are certainly not entirely up to us, right? To a certain degree, they're up to us. If you never join the mob, you will never face the decision, oh, do I kill this guy who's done nothing wrong, or do I finally, go to the police? Look, the mobster probably faces that choice because some earlier decisions he's made to join the mob. But nonetheless, a lot of the decisions we have, what decisions we face, seem almost entirely out of our control, or a lot of them do. So even if it is entirely up to us what we do when we face different decisions, it seems undeniable that we don't completely control what decisions we face. That is deeply disturbing, even if you grant the libertarian everything they want about free will. Even if what we do when faced with choices is up to us, how responsible can we really be if the choices we actually face are out of our control? Yes, let's say that the choice of whether to become a Nazi in 1930s Germany or a collaborator in 40s France is entirely up to that person, but it's not up to them that they are now presented with this choice of whether to collaborate or not, or whether to become a Nazi or not. How much does even the claim that you are free in the choices you make get you if you don't control what the choices are? What options you have? Finally, there's luck in how you are determined by antecedent circumstances. And this is the one where I anticipate the libertarian just putting their foot down right off the bat, right? They might say, oh, here, Nagel, you are completely begging the question. Precisely what I deny is that we are determined by antecedent circumstances. We have the freedom to do otherwise. What's come before does not entirely determine us. The response here, though, is look, you can't deny that antecedent circumstances play a role. I'll give you guys an example, right? I used to have just obnoxious downstairs neighbors, and just the worst sort of hipsters. I'd run into this guy in the halls. He'd have, one of those dumb, ironic mustaches, ironically wearing a trucker hat. Just, you'd think somebody would have enough self-respect not to be this caricatured a hipster, but he didn't. Whatever. He's free to look like an idiot, fine, whatever. I'm not going to begrudge him that. The reason I hated this dude, though, just he would randomly come home. He worked at one of the breweries in Knoxville where I lived at that point. And just after his shifts, he would come home drunk and just talk to his girlfriend very loudly at 2 in the morning, right? About the brewery. I can't do his stupid hipster voice, but it's very clear to me. He was right under me. The brewery. The things that were happening at the brewery. Sometimes these idiots would also play Mario Kart, middle of the week, stoned, 1 or 2 in the morning, right? Why do I bring this up, right? Because I had to work the next day. I had to teach. And if whatever this guy's name is, I don't know, insert dumbest hipster name you can think of, whether he comes home drunk and wakes me up at 2 in the morning is not in my control. But if I sleep really badly, if I go into work and have to teach on 2 or 3 hours of sleep, I've always had problems with insomnia, I'm going to act way differently than if I have a full night's sleep. Incidentally, I pounded on these people's doors. I talked to the landlord. It got better, but I think only because they thought I was completely psycho. Anyway. But my point being, whether someone wakes you up is completely outside of your control. But I would not do as good a job teaching if I had 3 hours of sleep as if I had 8, right? I would be a lot less patient with students than I would if I were fully rested, right? And anyone who tells me that, this doesn't affect you, you're just wrong, right? If you're not sleeping well or you're stressed, you're going to act differently than if you are, right? You might be able to make that choice when you're really irritated, you check yourself, or you try super hard even though you don't want to. But what's happened antecedently, the earlier circumstances are going to have an effect on your behavior, and they're outside of your control. Other stuff that plays the same role, right? If you throw your back out and you're in pain, right? Or, you know, you have horrible allergies, all of this stuff will affect your behavior. All of it is outside your control. Yet another sort of moral luck.